Yo, so this video is going to be the Ori and the Will of the Wisps QA. Long overdue. For the life of me, I can't remember why I didn't QA this when the game came out, which would have been 2 years and 9 months at this point. Especially since I had QA'd the first one like years ago. I don't know why I didn't QA this one. I was thinking about that while working on Ori 2 completionism edits, and I can't remember exactly what the reason was. I just didn't think the QA was worth it, given for a game this simple, and I had other Terraria completionism related priorities at the time. Well, here we are, almost 3 years later, and Terraria completionism still isn't done. Still working on that, and meanwhile, I haven't QA'd any other video games in so long. So that's why we're here, because I've been wanting to get back into quality analysis, talking about aesthetics, talking about art, not just random theory videos on I guess more kind of real life subjects. This game was interesting because it led me to reevaluate Ori and the Blind Forest, and I actually replayed both games for this review on normal to 100%. As it turns out, Will of the Wisps is probably more replayable than Ori 1, but I can't necessarily say overall that it's better. I think they're roughly around the same level of quality, but they're both, by and large, both games are quite similar. They're appealing in the same way, they're fun in the same way. They're also flawed in a similar way, but where their differences begin, they are sort of out of phase opposites. What Ori 1 is good at, Ori 2 is bad at, and sort of vice versa. Well, we're going to get into that later. This is probably going to be quite a much deeper review and QA than I did with Ori 1 when it came out.
I'm going to talk a little bit about gaming art, or rather, Ori and the Blind Forest. So, before I begin, I'm going to state a little maxim. Art is the meaning of life. Alright, moving on. Okay, no, what?
The other comparison that's going to come up a lot here is Hollow Knight. Since Ori 2 felt weirdly inspired by Hollow Knight and tried to emulate it in many instances, almost to the point of plagiarism. Like the shards, the map maker, the NPCs, Moldwood is basically Deep Nest, etc., right? While, of course, not even close to approaching Hollow Knight's depth, complexity, and atmosphere. Hollow Knight is still the best Metroidvania game. Let me be frank. Ori and the Will of the Wisps made me feel way more than Hollow Knight ever did, or other Metroidvanias for that matter, or most games in general, because this is probably one of the intensest, pathos games ever. But despite that, in terms of overall quality as a game, I have to evaluate it overall as a game, and overall, in that regard, well, I'm not sure exactly where I would put the two Ori games in the ranking, but Hollow Knight is still definitely the best Metroidvania of all time, with Super Metroid a close second, and these games are further down on that list. Despite the overall qualities, there are specific areas where Ori 2 and 1 surpass all the other games in the list, including Hollow Knight and Super Metroid by a long shot. And we're going to talk about that near the end as well. There's also an even more specific area where Ori 2 surpasses Ori 1. But yeah, let's start with the obvious, merit of this game. The art. Oh boy, the art. I mean, this is obvious without saying. You can tell it's not playing the game. The art is simply unmatched. It's an improvement upon Ori 1, which is insane considering that Ori 1 was already the best game in this dimension amongst Metroidvanias, amongst 2D games. Like, the art is what carries the game. You play it for the art, almost. You play it to look at this, like, insane kind of amazing visual experience. I don't know how long art takes in a development like this. I wouldn't be surprised if it was like 95% of production hours spent just on artwork. The artwork is so amazing. Any screen of Ori could be used as a screensaver. Literally, I could pop up a random screen of Ori 2 right now, and it probably works as a screensaver or a poster. other than like random transition screens. Hollow Knight art, by contrast, is good, but it's good as a style. It doesn't score the same heights of complexity, visual intensity, just you know, aesthetic, visual art complexity. It simply can't. Three guys working on a game will never reach the level of visual complexity present in a game like Ori. Hollow Knight's art is good, but it's good in the category of like good enough. It's enough to create the atmosphere. It's enough, and the rest is just the gameplay carrying you along, allowing you to enjoy the game. It's good enough in that regard. And I wouldn't say it's superficial. It's deep, but the atmosphere is it's never at the level of like pixel amazingness, pixel intensity as this game. It's almost overdone at times. Like sometimes in Ori 2, you may even want to just pause the game to inspect the background and see what's up, and just feel like you're there. You know, like you're at wherever in the screen is. And that's the thing. This game's locations and art make you feel like you're in actual places or actual places you wish were real so you could visit. Whereas other games in the genre just feel like places in a game. They don't invoke the same kind of like longing. Let's talk about environment quality. There's a lot of great zones in this game. Each zone on an individual level, great, incredibly detailed, incredibly rich, colorful, memorable, you know, especially when you get out of the central area of Inkwater Marsh. They play quite differently as well. The game has a very broad range of mechanics, much broader than Blind Forest did. You have Moldwood Depths, for example, which is this whole dark area that's very hard to navigate. Bower's Reach, with the whole the freezing, melting the furnaces, which freezes certain things in the level, allowing you to either making it easier or harder to traverse, you know, or making it possible or impossible. It changes the doodads in the environment, unfreezing the clams, etc. That's on an individual level. The environments are very good. On the whole, and when I mean whole, I mean like the whole world, the gameplay world, these environments, while extraordinary in their own right, don't really fit together as well as the environments in Ori 1 did. In Ori 1, the forest of Nibel felt like an actual forest. Every zone felt like it was a smaller part in a grander forest, but everything was kind of forest-like. You know, like it cohered to an overarching forest aesthetic. Whereas Ori 2, Niwen doesn't necessarily feel like a forest. It feels like mostly a large swamp in the middle, you know, with a mountain to the north, a beach to the west, a desert to the east, you know, a dank cave to the south. You know, you see what I mean? It's like there's this diverse range of aesthetics and environments that don't necessarily fit together. Like they're trying to squish as many different aesthetics into this game as possible, and that worked out great. Except that I don't have a concrete sense of what Niwen is as a place as I do with Nibel. Perhaps Nibel is more of a forest and Niwen is more of a marsh or a swamp, since the swamp aesthetic comes up most throughout the game, but not coherent enough compared to aesthetics like Silent Woods or Windswept Wastes. I do think if the game needed to be bigger to kind of encapsulate all the different aesthetics and make them more smoothly fit together, you know? Like you swim through a tunnel and suddenly you're in the Silent Woods, which are this totally dead wood, and then you cross one screen, you're in Windswept Waste, which is a completely different... Like, it's just... It ranges, you know, it's got everything from A to Z, which feels like too much to feel coherent, I guess. And the final area of the game, Willow's End, on that note, is so weird and bizarre. Willow's End feels like an alien planet rather than the root of a tree. But on its own, it too is a very good area, like I said. It's actually a very nice way of having a very dangerous sort of world-ending perilous dungeon that right at the end of the game that matches the same sort of action levels of Mount Horu in Ori 1, but still looking totally distinct from Ori 1. I liked the whole pink lava aesthetic. It was really neat. My favorite environment, however, on that note, my favorite environment is definitely Luma Pools. I loved loved Luma pools. I fucking adored Luma pools. Luma pools was so cool. This part is totally subjective, of course, and it's, the environments are great. I don't think everyone's going to love Luma pools as much as I did, but Luma pools felt like the perfect area. It was beautiful, dense, lush, and what's so special about it is it just felt this like pleasant, warm, relaxing, and peaceful, while also being incredibly exotic. Luma pools look so nice and welcoming. I wish it existed in real life. I wish I could visit it and just live in it and just sit on the beach next to these pink palm trees, I swear, part of me just wants to open up the game and just take Ori to Luma and just sit in Luma and just leave the game on, and so that I could just enjoy the surroundings. I could maybe, I wonder if there's like a video with just like the Luma background playing somewhere that I could have as like a screensaver, but something about it is just so special. It's like it's got the niceness of a Caribbean island, plus these lush pink trees and grass mixed with all of these like intense blues in the water and this like ancient underground ruin aesthetic as well. It's all just very, very good. I've never experienced an environment in a game that was just, wasn't just like narratively captivating, but alluring on a personal, experiential level. I actually personally want to go there and just be there and exist there. Anyway, that's enough. That's Luma Pool. I haven't felt like that in another game, but that's enough of me raving about the environment. The environments were very good, as you can see. Let's talk about the gameplay. The more mediocre parts of Ori 2, I guess. So Ori 2 and Ori 1 are both good at different things in the gameplay. Ori 2 absolutely expands the gameplay mechanics, completionism, questing, NPC interaction, and the whole world compared to Ori 1. Ori 1 was much smaller. However, it's weird because it didn't feel smaller when I was playing it. As I was playing it, I actually was wondering, was this game shorter than Ori 1? Ori 1 was smaller, but the big flaw is that Ori 2 is that Ori 1 felt way more complete than Ori 2 as a game. Ori 1 was simple. You just had basic jumping, and combat was literally a joke. Combat was literally just spamming the button and clicking while Sen auto-targets enemies for you. But, the abilities that you had were used to their fullest. Each zone played you hard. You actually had to use Ori's abilities to the best of your ability. As a result, Ori 1 was way harder than Ori 2. Just as an example, for this review, I replayed both games to full completionism. Ori 2 took me 9 hours and I died 15 times on normal. Ori 1 took me 4 hours and I died 53 times on normal. What else do I need to say? That's like, Ori 1, that's over 3 times the death rate. Ori 1 stretches the mechanics to their limits. For one, there's a lot of insta-kill spots, insta-kill lasers, beams, or just spikes that will take out all of your life cells in like 2 or 3 hits. Every ability is stretched thin to pass these obstacles. From wall jump, double jump, bash, you're often forced to make perfect jumps. Perfect like jumps that are almost like, not pixel perfect, but like very little, room for error. There's often times where you have to stay wall jumped up against a wall with spikes right underneath you, and you have to stay wall jumped for a while you're waiting for like a insta-kill beam to turn off or something else. Or you're wall jumping, but you're trying to wall jump up, and the ledge above you has spikes. And so you have to jump onto that ledge and then double jump over the spikes so you don't immediately hit the spikes and fall back down. There's and other stuff like there's a whole Misty Woods area where there's prolonged sections where you just have to stay feathered because there's spikes all over the place all around you. And you have to stay feathered while you float through the Misty Woods, etc., etc. The game really stretches all of your gameplay tools. Ori 2 does not. Ori 2 simply doesn't. It's kind of pathetic. Like Ori 2 feels easy. You pick up an ability, you use it once or twice, and then you basically forget about it. You know, when you do use it, it's easy enough to use. It's not these like tough sequences where you're surrounded by spike. You absolutely must rely on the ability you pick to proceed as perfectly as possible, or else you're fucked. You know, so that's part of Ori 2's feeling of incompleteness, which I'm going to keep coming back to throughout this whole thing. The game doesn't take its abilities and movement tech as far as it can. This is especially visible with the 4 abilities you pick up in the second half of the game, 3 of which are completely new. The 4 abilities the post Silent Woods section of the game, the second half of the game, after you pick up Feather, the second half of the game has you go to Bower's Reach, Moldwood Depths, Luma Pools, and Windswept Wastes in order to pick up Light Burst, Burrow, Swim Dash, and Flash. And these 4 abilities are not used really outside of the zones where you pick them up, except for a few spots in like Inkwater Marsh and other zones where you use some of the abilities to pick up stray collectibles. Like there's sand areas that are blocked off. You need Burrow to go through the sand. You don't really use them other than that, though. The most disappointing one is actually Flash. The entire Moldwood Depth section is very difficult to traverse. You know, I remember hating it during my Deathless runs, because I got Deathless in this game. I got every achievement and played through the game 7 times originally, like 3 years ago when it came out. And Flash was a breath of fresh air when you pick it up. When you finally get through Moldwood Depths, you figure out this labyrinth. You get Flash. You're like, oh, finally, I can move here without dying. But as immediately after you pick up Flash, you then go fight Mora, and then suddenly all of Moldwood becomes lit up, making Flash essentially useless. And Flash is literally never used anywhere in the game after that, except for this one cave in Wellspring Glades that you need to go for like a mini quest to pick up like a stick or something. This is the big problem. Like, Flash could have been used so much more. You could have had a whole nother dark area that you needed Flash just to get into, you know? Where you would have had to traverse it by surviving, by getting, you know, energy resupply, because Flash drains your energy. And you could have had so much other stuff in that area. You could have had, like, beams or some sort of water that drains your energy, making it more difficult to survive, and you'd have to avoid that while you're jumping through this other area. Do you know what I mean? There's so many ways they could have played with the Flash ability that they really didn't do. And this isn't just Flash. Throughout the game, right? Swim Dash is the same thing. Swim Dash is only useful in Luma. You know, Light Burst is only really useful in Bower's Reach. Burrow is mostly used in Windswept Wastes and maybe just a few other areas for collectibles. But these abilities are not used to their fullest effectiveness that you can imagine. They needed to be used in more than just the area where you got them. One of the things that makes Ori 1 feel so progressive is that each ability is utilized immediately in the next area, and it's absolutely necessary to have it just to traverse the game. Now, this does, in Ori 1, this is very linear, which isn't too good, but what it also does is it makes the game sort of expand as you go through. It makes the world feel bigger as you go through it, which is what a Metroidvania is supposed to have. Ori 2, by contrast, because it's so non-linear and open, it's like too open. At the beginning of the game, you don't have anything, but you pick up abilities very quickly. You get Sword and then Double Jump, like one right after the other, then Arrow, then Bash, you know, and so on and so forth. And you basically get everything in like an hour of gameplay, and then you have to go get Grapple. And then you have to go to the Silent Woods where you get Feather. And at that point, that's like halfway through the game, everything is just opened up for you. After Grapple, you pretty much have access to the whole map. So it doesn't feel like the map opens up anymore after that. Like I said, the 4 abilities you pick up in the second half of the game don't serve to expand the world anymore. The world is already at its full size. Those 4 abilities, all they do is you need them to complete the zone that they're in. I'm pretty sure Swim Dash is only used in like 3 places in Luma 2 to finish Luma to get Quolock. And like I said, Flash is only used in Moldwood. It's just disappointing, right? So like you need them technically, but the map doesn't really open up as a result of you having them. The feeling of progression just isn't there. It would have been if each zone you picked up one of the four, you had an additional zone that required that ability. Like I said, with Moldwood, you know, you could have an additional zone deeper past Moldwood where you need Flash just to have, where you have to rely on having sufficient energy to go through dark spaces, where the game could then create new challenges by playing with that energy mechanic and challenging you by trying to introduce enemies or things that try to drain your energy, making it hard to keep your Flash up. Or after getting Swim Dash, you could go into an additional zone that's deeper past Luma, where you would need to swim really fast to traverse the area, or combining the two, where you could have to swim through an area, you know, an underwater cave where you're always underwater, plus having Flash at the same time, having to combine both the difficulty of swim dashing as well as the difficulty of being in the dark. What I'm imagining is honestly similar to Dark Souls 1. If you've played Dark Souls 1, the great example of this is the world expands, but then it expands more as you go further, as you traverse, as you get tools and are able to traverse each area. So for example, you have the catacombs, which is like the first area in the game where you encounter skeletons and necromancers and, you know, those sort of kind of skeletal enemies. And after you pass it, you get to the Tomb of Giants, which is the next skeleton area, but the skeletons are bigger and more dangerous than in Catacombs because it's pitch black and you need a new tool just to be able to see. That's what I feel the 4 post-Silent Woods abilities in Ori needed. Like an additional zone where they're used and maybe used in combinations of each other in you know, one zone after the next, to have like just to have more of a feeling of progression. And then you could have a zone that really tries to use all of these abilities, you know, in difficult way. Here's another thing, and this is kind of another completionism point, but the 4 Wisps also felt like they needed to do something. It would have been cool if they had abilities like Sen did with like Charge Flame or something in Ori 1. It would have been cool if, you know, the Wisps could do something. Like maybe one of the Wisps, I had the idea while I was playing the game, but maybe one of the Wisps could create the blue grasp you would need to grapple onto surfaces and stuff like that. They really needed to do something with the Wisps. The Wisps were just MacGuffins, as it turns out. They serve a narrative purpose, but like they felt like they have names. Like the names could have been tied to something the Wisps did. One of the Wisps could have, the Wisp of the Strength of the Forest could be a, you know, a combat upgrade in some way. The memory could have allowed some other, like you had to have a mechanic around these Wisps. I realize all of this would have involved making the game a lot bigger, but I feel like it's a necessary critique in the context where the game introduces all of these mechanics and doesn't use them to their fullest, and the feeling of incompleteness comes from that. This is one of the main reasons, anyway, that Ori 2, even though Ori 2 is twice as long as Ori 1, it feels fast and short. Like, I don't feel like I've truly seen this world as thoroughly because its abilities, other than grapple, which is used all the time, its other abilities are just forgettable. You know, they aren't woven into the gameplay enough. It's literally a quantity issue, not a quality issue. The quality of the abilities is very cool. And Swim Dash Burrow and stuff, they also fit Ori's fast style of like movement gameplay very, very well. The jumping acrobatics and stuff, it's integrated with that stuff super well. It's just not utilized enough. So let's talk now about quests, mini quests, NPC interactions. Let's talk about NPC interactions in the world. At the beginning of my first playthrough, I was super excited when they added quests and NPC interactions. The first game, Blind Forest felt just sort of barren. All you had with world interaction was Sen telling you things each time you found a tree. You know, I could see the Hollow Knight inspiration as well with how they did the map maker and like the basic fetch quest where an NPC would like vaguely tell you something that was in the world and then you had to find it. The novelty of the quests and NPC interactions wears off pretty quickly, however. See, this is more the incompleteness I'm talking about. I shouldn't say incompleteness. I should say incompleteness sounds like the game is unfinished. It doesn't feel like the game is unfinished. It feels like the game is undercomplete as opposed to overcomplete. A game is overcomplete if there's an enormous amount of stuff to do, items to acquire to complete the game, boxes to check and so on, to reach full completion, that goes beyond the main level progression or main quest or storyline. In this case, the core form of progress in the game is totally outpaced by random collectibles, side activities, and stuff that requires grind. Undercomplete is the opposite. Undercomplete is if there isn't enough stuff to do with the mechanics of the game before the end of the game. Okay, so it's tied to this idea of like what the main progression of the game is and what the side activities around that progression are. What the gameplay around the progression, because a progression is always linear, what the gameplay around the progression feels like. Overcomplete is when there's too much of it. The game is done before all the stuff around the game, being done is done. Undercomplete is when there's not enough of it. So yeah, undercomplete is if there isn't enough stuff to do with the mechanics before the end, which as I've already talked about, is there with how Ori's abilities and level design work. But it's the same with the NPC questing and world interaction as well. As much as I appreciate the Gorlek ore collectible or like the Wellspring Glade minigame and the Seed minigames and the other quests, I really felt like this was the right way to go, but they never really deliver as either in gameplay or story. The completion of these new collectibles and fetch quests is very brief. It's quite forgettable, and not simply because doing them is like too easy, and the game overall is easy, so you don't feel like you need to get them done, or because the reward is usually just Spirit Light or Gorlek ore or more collectibles that all just kind of feel like nothing when you pick them up, and add nothing besides allowing you to do more of the same. It's not the fact that like collectibles shouldn't feel like nothing. They should have an important gameplay purpose to motivate you to collect them. Yeah, I wonder. Sorry if that sentence sounded weird, but it's like it's not just the fact that they are collectibles. It's the fact that they feel so easy that they feel like nothing. Collecting items in Ori doesn't feel, well, to be fair, this applies a little bit in the first game. Collecting items in Ori in general doesn't feel that rewarding in both games. It was the same in Blind Forest. It's not like the reason why, and I shouldn't say that it's not the case with Super Metroid or Hollow Knight. Collecting things in those games does not feel like nothing. It's not a problem of collectathons in general. I tend to like collectathons, especially if they're done well. Assassin's Creed, for example, collectibles usually work to some degree because they force you to explore the city, and kind of experience it. But in Ori, the collectibles are just too obvious and too simple. Right? In a Metroidvania, you need to have a feeling of discovery, and the discovery comes from discovering the collectibles. But in Ori, it's like they're not really discovered because where they are is obvious. You don't discover them, you already know where they're going to be, you just need to go get them. Like I noticed that they're often just sitting on an obvious ledge, you can clearly see where they are, it's just a matter of jumping to them or getting the right ability to get enough height to get to them. But you don't really discover them. It's not like Hollow Knight where you're looking around all over the place trying to find something because you don't know what you're looking for, and then you find an ability or you find a charm or you find a collectible where finding things actually feels like an achievement because you weren't expecting to find them in the first place. But in Ori, the finding of things feels flat because you're supposed to find things to begin with, and where they are is also just obvious. It's not tied to difficulty of exploration at all or to progression that much either. And that's another thing. I think the important thing with collectathons isn't so much that they should be tied with progression, because that actually makes them kind of annoying if you absolutely need them. It's mostly the fact that they're tied with the feeling of discovery. You need to feel like you're finding things as a player. You need to feel like you're finding things, and that comes from having kind of an initial sense of not knowing what you're going to find, or that you're supposed to find things and finding them anyway, rather than knowing immediately you're going to find things, this is how they're going to, where they're going to be, how they're going to look, and just figuring out the steps to get there. That's a collectathon thing. Anyway, the quests and NPCs are also in the same kind of incompleteness vein as the collectible stuff. Like you can interact with NPCs, but the interactions are fairly thin. Like you can interact with Twillin, the shard salesman, and the problem is that the shards are almost completely unnecessary to play the game, except for when you play on hard mode. That you like the game is hard enough that you absolutely need them. See, that's the thing, is that in Ori includes the elements of other Metroidvanias without really knowing what to do with them. Like the shard system is straight out of Hollow Knight with the charm system. It's the exact same system. Only the charm system in Hollow Knight is absolutely necessary for progression. Right? Well, I mean, it's not technically completely, like, absolutely necessary. You can break the game and not get any charms. You can be a god. But for the average run, for the average person, you have to make use of charms. You have to make use of charms just as you're going through, because the game is hard enough and the charms give you an additional advantage just to get through. In Ori's case, none of the shards are fundamentally necessary because difficulty isn't tied to them, because the whole shard system is just sort of a gimmick. And like all the collectibles tied to the shard system as well. The combat system, same thing. The combat system, while cool, while the correct, it's the correct form, I guess, of expanding Ori 1's, system, because Ori 1's combat is literally just clicking. The combat, the idea of all these little weapons, the sword, the hammer, it's cool, but again, it's not fundamentally useful for progression. Like, you only really need the sword and the bow, and the hammer occasionally just to crack some walls, but nothing else. There's 4 other weapons, okay, that are completely superfluous. You never need to use them at all. And it's like, the game isn't big enough either for... I don't mind the idea that you don't need them. You can just use them if you like and to see if it's fun, but the game isn't big enough for you to make use of them anyway. For you to, really just play around however you like. Games that are too open are problematic because they need to make the different styles of play feel like you want to try them, not just have them. That's what I usually get about games that are too open in terms of completion. It's fine to have a game that's super open where you have a lot of different options and builds, but you need to make the player want to try them. In Ori 2, there's no real need to even want to try them because a lot of the different weapons aren't even better. So anyway, interactions that stem from them feel unfulfilling as well. The additional activities that did, besides just the combat stuff itself, that did feel quite on point in Ori 2 were the combat shrines and spirit trials. Especially the spirit trials, actually, which make use of Ori's speedy movement mechanics. The spirit trials were kind of perfect. They were the perfect expansion of Ori 1's system. Ori 1 needed stuff like that. These things were like, I remember initially playing the game feeling this was the perfect way to expand the game and have you do more stuff, this sort of stuff. And it didn't feel incomplete because spirit trials are literally just races. It's literally, in a game that's all about moving fast, the races were the perfect addition. It says kind of a lot when the best activity is tied to movement and not combat or collection, though. It shows Ori's real strength. Ori's core gameplay is not combat and it's not collecting things. It's actually moving. It's moving and it's moving fast. And that's something to keep in mind if they ever do a third game, is that these games are fundamentally about movement and everything needs to be designed around making you move as much as possible. You needed stuff like these spirit trial and combat shrine activities woven into NPC interaction as well. For example, you could have had another activity with some of the other abilities. You could have had an arrow mini game where, because you have to use a bow, and when you're using a bow, you're standing still. You have to stand still and hit targets. Or sometimes you have to use a bow while falling. That's harder to do, hitting a target while falling. But there's ways that the game could have made use of that sort of mechanic as well. There could have been little activities that make you use all the different weapons that the guy sells. It's broad to say, but the quests and NPCs, still talking about NPCs, The quests and NPCs were also kind of lame. Most of the NPCs were so one-dimensional that they barely brought anything to the setting besides the fact that they were like animal creatures. The Moki especially. The Moki feel like nothing except like cute Disney critters that you're not really invested in. Because what is there to invest in? They're cute, they're jungle cats, they do jungle cat things, but why do I care? Like, what makes me care about them? The scene at the end where you see a flashback of Moki finding Ori at the beginning of the game feels like almost nothing. The problem with the Moki is that they're too simple to really give you anything to feel for the world than what you already have. They're there to look cute and to have small, trifling problems that only Ori can solve. The other characters, while seemingly more sophisticated, are still one-dimensional. Like Talk, the Gopher, the Mapmaker, all these characters have almost nothing going on and often just serve as accessories for completion or helping Ori get through the game rather than to add to the setting. Like, Talk, the bird, travels around the world, but he travels in no particular direction or order, unlike the NPCs in Hollow Knight, who have their own distinct motivations for traveling the world and reaching a certain destination and path. You have to find them in specific locations before they move on. Talk shows up everywhere. Also, the NPCs in Hollow Knight, by contrast, they're not just gameplay accessories. They have their own personalities and take on the world. For example, you have the wandering warrior looking for the Blue Lake. You have who helps you fight who helps you get to one of the dreamers. You have the guy looking to prove himself in the arena who ends up dead. You have Zout the Mighty. You have the old man in Dirtmouth who just wants to stay there and tells you about like things going on in the world. You have the nailsmith, who's this craftsman who wants to make nails. You have the collector, who's into super esoteric lore stuff, who will tell you about lore if you give him trinkets, etc. Like, all the NPCs in Hollow Knight felt very integrated into the world, integrated into the setting, like they had their own kind of distinct goal, their own distinct place in this world. In Ori, none of the NPCs have personalities outside of some dialogue where they tell you how they feel about the decay and what it did to them and stuff. But they don't feel like what their place in the world is outside of that. Like, they don't feel like they have a presence in this world in and of itself, regardless of just what they look like. What their society looks like. What is their society? What is their economy? What is their, like, what is their outside of how they help you play, what is their function in the world? That's the thing that's the question that they needed to answer to make the NPCs more two-dimensional. That said, there are a few times when the NPCs did surprise me and had a little bit more complexity than the default. So, for example, like there's this guy Key, which is the guy in the mask who you find in Silent Woods, and he's kind of interesting because he hates you. And he hates the spirits because they abandoned his home and let it fall to decay. And just the fact that his attitude is so different than the other NPCs makes him interesting. He also shows up randomly in Silent Woods, and you can find him there. And that's an example of what I'm talking about. Just having an NPC show up almost randomly, to tell you stuff, to help inform you about the world. And that's not part of progression. You don't need Key to be there. But he shows up anyway. I didn't even find him on my first playthrough of the game. I missed some of the spots where he shows up. Then you have another example, which is you have a random Moki looking for his family. He's looking for his family who live in a house in Silent Woods, and this is part of a quest. Once you find them, turns out they're dead, and then you tell him, and then he runs off and dies with them, turned to stone by the decay. Now, I remember being actually impressed by this, because this isn't part of the quest. Like, there's the part of the quest that you do, and then there's additional things that you just find. See, that's why the Dark Souls Hollow Knight formula works so well. Without there being quests, you find NPCs on their own, and that act of finding them makes it feel like discovery. Whereas you have a quest telling you to go fetch, there's no discovery there because you know what you're doing. You have complete knowledge before you even do it. I was actually impressed with the fact that this Moki ended up going to his family and dying, right? Because it's not part of the quest, and it's like that little detail is like Hollow Knight's level of detail. I really like that part. But you know, you needed more of that. You just needed more. That was literally just two examples. I honestly can't even think of other examples. There was a few other things in the gameplay that did surprise me though. The Gopher Seed quest, which puts a mini spirit tree in the Wellspring Glades, was a nice surprise. And the Seed quest's way of kind of improving the glades was by adding grass and stuff, you know, and doodads that help you explore the glades was a good form of completionism. The entire idea of the Wellspring Glades was kind of it made sense as an idea for completionism, the way you kind of, you know, just improve this area in little ways that help you explore different parts of it. But the ways are little, but there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of little upgrades you get that end up filling out the whole hub. So, you know, that little kind of mini exploration of the glades with those two quests, the Gorlek quest and the Seed quest, were good. But so you had a few nuggets of quality here and there, but you needed way more stuff like this, like way more stuff. You needed to have stuff. You needed each NPC to have stuff. Like, most of the Moki felt pointless. Most of the NPCs didn't feel like characters outside of their role in gameplay. Like, they didn't have personal motivations or goals or even beliefs. Like, heck, Hollow Knight knew how to do NPCs because Hollow Knight knew how to make fun of itself. Like, so it had NPCs that were meant to be a joke. Like, you had Zoth the Mighty, who was literally just a joke NPC, to, you know, so that you could laugh at the game, which contrasted the fact that other parts of the game were all super kind of dreary and serious, right? There's nothing like that in Ori. Ori's NPCs take themselves super seriously the whole time, which is funny because they end up coming across as lame as a result because there's often little to take seriously, you know? Like, you could have had a whole Moki village somewhere where you interact with more of the Moki and see a whole, like, Moki society, or you could have had NPC-specific quest chains. Like, you could have had more narrative, like, why does the monkey guy sell light weapons that only, you know, spirits like Ori can use? Why is Twillin interested in shards? What kind of society do these NPCs have? Why do they all want to live in the glades? Do they have a leader? Do they have a chieftain? Something like that. Some sort of goal. Anyway, this would have required making the game even bigger, which, you know, I think it was necessary to make the game feel whole. Hollow Knight feels whole, felt whole. It didn't feel like anything was missing. And Ori 1 felt whole, but Ori 1 felt less. Like, there was nothing in Ori 1, right? Which is why it felt whole, because there was less in it to begin with. There was less things in the game. There's less kind of toys in the box to begin with to make it to make you feel like you had played with all the toys. You know, Ori and the Will of the Wisps, like, they sure have. It has all these great mechanics, activities, all these new weapons and tools and shards, but none of it is utilized and integrated into the world or characters or setting so that it feels like it's an important part of the experience. Ori, the basic difference is Ori 1 felt like you had very few toys in the box, but you used all of them. You used all of them as well as you could, and the fact that you played with all of them, you kind of fill out the kind of negative gameplay space of the negative experiential space that is filled out by the game as you go through it. In Ori 2, you had lots of toys in the box, but you didn't get to play that much with any of them. And so that negative experiential space feels unfilled. It feels like there's more space to be filled out that hasn't been filled out. So that's gameplay. That's gameplay, world, and characters. Let's talk about the story. Overall, the story of Ori 2 felt more or less like the perfect, like a suitable addition to the first game. However, I should say right now, the incompleteness and shortness thing of the world impacts the story as well. Not enough time was spent interacting with some of these characters. Like, I didn't care a whole lot about Ku. Yes, Ku was cute. Yes, Ku was nice. But, like, you didn't really interact with her once. Like, you interact with her once in Silent Woods, and that's it. And once in the prologue, and that's it. For you to feel like saving Ku is some sort of accomplishment, you needed more interaction with her. You feel sorry for Ku, because Ku's this cute little owlet getting smushed on, but, like, you needed more interaction with her to really care. Same thing with Quolock. You don't really interact with him enough to care about him either when he gets possessed. It could be that the game is like meant for a younger audience who may have lower standards for this sort of thing, which would line up with gameplay being much easier as well, and that's fine. But I still have to judge the game by adult standards, because a good piece of children's fiction is good if it appeals to adults as well. It's true. Like, and this game could very well appeal to adults. It just didn't do enough. It's easier said than done, but it is possible. This is also why perhaps Ori takes itself so seriously when there isn't a lot in it to be invested in. The first game managed to avoid this problem by not having you interact with characters a whole lot in general. Instead, there's pretty much no characters in the game, and the entire stakes of the story are conveyed by just the spirit tree narrating things to you and the text popping up on screen. Once you have... That's the thing. It's done through narration, the storytelling. Once you have character interaction directly, once you have NPC dialogue and characters, talking to each other and being with each other, once you're there talking to Quolocks, riding coups, then you need to have complexity in those interactions in order to care. At that point, the overarching narration just isn't enough. You're expected to care about the things that these characters talk about, the decay, Nguyen, the Disney critters, but the game doesn't compel you to care. It doesn't make you care about them. It just sort of presents them and expects that you will. The exception to this, however, and then get to the good part of the story, the exception to this is Shriek. Shriek was very well done, I should say. Shriek was a nice level up from the villain of the first game, Kuro. Shriek was more evil, more terrifying, more deadly, and more well presented. What I like best about Shriek is that her problem doesn't ever not make sense. With Kuro's, I mentioned the whole thing of like, why is Kuro raising her family next to this forest of Nibel where the tree can like plasma blast her kids and kill them. But also what I like about Shriek is that they don't try to redeem her. One of the annoying things in this Ori world is that they try to frame the whole world as full of these innocent, like sensitive creatures, all needing love and compassion. And in the first game, you had the redemption of Kuro. Kuro was only trying to protect her children. And in this game, you had a little too much of that as well, because all of the creatures are so nice and sensitive and warm. Even Mora the spider. I was rolling my eyes when it turned out that Mora just became a good guy after you defeated her. And all the spiderlings that you just, were just murdering, like them by the dozen while you fought her, all the spiderlings are now good creatures. It's like the game wanted to be way too forgiving to all of these creatures. Even the spiders are these sensitive things you need to care about. The only one that gets no forgiveness at all is the faceless parasite that tries to possess Quolock. It doesn't have a face or relatable features, so you don't have to care about it. But the break from this pattern of over forgiveness, other than the faceless thing, is Shriek herself. And this was the correct move. It separates her from everything else and makes Shriek's whole shtick way more serious. Shriek, unlike Kuro, is not driven by anything noble, anything warm, like protecting her children. She just hates the world. And even though they try to make her seem a little... They still try to hit a soft spot in making you feel compassion for Shriek with how she was treated. At the end, Shriek still is just a villainous force in the story. She's driven by pure, unmitigated malice and resentment against owls and tree spirits. Shriek isn't looking, from what we can tell, Shriek is not looking to accomplish anything. She just wants revenge. It's interesting, too, because the decay itself that starts the whole like collapse of Nguyen has nothing to do with her. The decay started when the Spirit Willow died, but the Spirit Willow died naturally, and then Sayer split into the four Wisps. Shriek and the death of the Owls came later as the decay spread. And I wonder, or at least speculate, that part of the reason the decay continued spreading and wasn't stopped by the spirits, Ori's people, who are meant to like collect the wisps and solve the problem. They're meant to fuse with the wisps to create a new tree. The reason that may not have happened is because Shriek hunted them all down and killed them, both owls and spirits. And that makes... they don't directly say that. That's my inference, but that makes Shriek seem even more terrifying. The other cool thing about Shriek is the personal connection Shriek has to Ori. See, the fact that Ori and Shriek interact multiple times, and Ori even offers to spare Shriek from Sayre when Sayre could have killed her, helps establish a tension between these two characters. Much more so than there was between Ori and Kuro, who didn't really care, and it was just seeing Naru wanting to protect her child. Ori is what had a character impact on Kuro. Shriek, by contrast, has direct interactions with Ori, and an actual tension seems to form between the two of them. So when at the end, when you're fighting her, Shriek's resentment and hatred of all life kind of becomes fixated on Ori, specifically because Ori is the only one who seemingly has the power to undo all the damage of the decay and save the forest. Yeah, and that brings me to, I guess, my last big point about Ori, and I've talked a lot about where Ori fails, or Ori and the Will-O-Wisps fails as a game, or doesn't have the same kind of like quality level as other Metroidvanias on the gameplay front. And I should say, by the way, that Ori 2, all of the stuff I said about incompleteness, it doesn't make Ori 2 worse than Ori 1, because it's a quantity over quality trade-off thing. Ori 1 has less, or Ori 1 feels more complete, but it has less stuff, which is why as an overall work, it doesn't have that much more quality. Completeness, there's quality and quantity both matter. Quantity and quality both matter in the equation of total quality, right? Total quality is made less for a game that's shorter simply because it's less value, it's less presence, right? It's a shorter game. So Ori 1 is shorter, Ori 1 has less quality. Ori 2 is around the same level despite being longer because of the incompleteness. If Ori 2 were complete, Ori 2 would be a better game than Ori 1, hands down. It would transcend Ori 1 for sure. As it stands, it transcends Ori 1 mechanically, but it feels so incomplete that it's still around at the same level in terms of total quality. It doesn't transcend it at quality level. It's more quantity, without the added quality that's gained from achieving that completeness criterion. But anyway, that's enough about that. Let me talk about the last thing, which I think is where Ori truly shines above every other Metroidvania game. And that category is cinematic power. There's a reason that I think that this game is still great, despite all the complaints I've had. There's a reason that I say it made me feel, even though on a rational basis, it's so easy to tune out the story and just not care. Everything in Ori is so simplistic. The world, the setting, the characters, it all lacks complexity. But the reason is because Ori isn't going for that sort of complexity. It's not going for narrative complexity. It's going for complexity of intensity and spectacle. It's going for maximum pathos, emotion, and care condensed into these unrelenting visual sequences. It's going for complexity of presentation. That comes back to the artwork thing there. It's all about the presentation of this world that matters, not necessarily the world itself. The presentation being full of energy and visual complexity and emotional purity. The emotional purity is part of why other aspects of the complexity of the world are lost. They need to be abandoned for everything to feel pure and innocent and so warm, to have all these characters feel so kind of earnest and and sensitive and fragile, that you feel compassion for them. They need to have this purity and innocence to the world, which makes you care about the world during the tensest moments of the game, even though the world itself is still so like primitive on a complexity level. And the best example of this feeling of cinematic intensity is the escape sequences. I'm talking, of course, the avalanche in Bowers Reach, the sandworm escape from the temple when you're escaping the wellspring, and of course the boss fights. The boss fights with Quolock, Mora, and Shriek. It's interesting because I keep saying how in Ori the movement gameplay is way more fun than the combat gameplay. The combat's just kind of there. Well, these escape sequences really demonstrate that. Like the escape sequences are more fun than the boss fights. Like it feels like Ori's version of a boss fight is just an escape sequence in its own. That's a boss fight in its own right. And in the cases where they're paired with actual fighting and sword swinging, isn't as fun as just the movement sequences in all three cases. Even the Shriek fight, which admittedly does have a lot for a boss fight in this game, especially in the last phase where you're jumping, and bashing off of all the bullets flying over nothing. But the first and middle phases where you just have to hit the bird in the head, you feel kind of it still feels kind of lame compared to the parts where you have to move very fast and make use of the difficult platforming, because the combat in Ori is ultimately just spam. It's just spamming your button in whichever direction. But the movement is Ori's true test of skill in both games. It's all about the jumping, the gliding, the bashing, the keeping, the floating with the feather, keeping yourself suspended in the air. That's actually Ori's core gameplay mechanic. That's where movement is best integrated into combat, is where the combat feels best. And the other thing, so there's that. The other thing that gives you this feeling of cinematic complexity is the score. The score is simply majestic. Unlike Hollow Knight, Ori uses a real orchestra for both games, and the composition feels, orchestral, symphonic, grand and heart-pounding. Exactly what you want in this like sprawling, dramatic epic. Gareth Coker, he gives scenes this massive oomph with his score, with his soundtrack, which gives it the emotion and pathos. You can't not care when hearing those sounds. That's the power of music right there. Even when the world is kind of lame, the music makes it feel powerful. The most memorable thing with the soundtrack from Ori 1, other than the main theme, of course, is the track Fleeing Kuro, which this sort of like desperate, heart-pounding track, which gives an intense feeling of escape when you're trying to flee the bird and the forest burns all around you, and everything just seems to be falling apart. It's this really great sequence, probably the best sequence in Ori 1. But this game, Ori Will of the Wisps, surpasses that with the whole final sequence and how you get there. The final sequence of this game is amazing. First, it's when Ori gets to the Willow, and the Willow talks to Ori, and then Sayre goes into the Willow and explains what's going on, how the Willow's gonna die, and Sayre goes back to Ori, and we know exactly what's gonna happen as Sayre's flying back. I knew exactly what this was gonna be, but knowing what was gonna happen didn't make it feel any less emotional. Like, Shriek swoops in last second, crushing Sayre in her talons, meaning that Sayre cannot energy blast and kill her now, because I think, like the way Sayre did in the desert cutscene earlier, and I think the reason is because Sayre needs to be close to Ori to unleash its sort of wisp power. The wisps need a conduit or something. Thus, when Shriek disables Sayre, Sayre's out of the picture, and that immediately puts everything at risk, because the Willow is dead. Sayre is lost, and now Ori has to fight Shriek on her own, or it's all over. And all of this immediately, this all happens very fast, in like a few seconds, this last confrontation, and as soon as this happens, Shriek swoops in, she flies back, and immediately that score kicks in. The score kicks in. And it's so good. And it's such this like immediately starts building this like tension, this powerful heart pound, like the intensity kick builds up and builds up. And this track is great. This track is amazing. It changes phases for the different phases of the fight. As the fight escalates and transforms, you have to go through an escape sequence while platforms are collapsing. You have to escape Shriek, and the song gets more desperate and more intense and more powerful as you go. And that escape sequence is similar to the Fleeing Kuro section. And by the way, I think the track matches the action best if you're playing on easy mode. If you're playing on easy mode, I think the track like perfectly lines up with the action, whereas in normal and hard mode, the action falls behind. But then you get to the second platform, and now the track really kicks into high gear, and you have the choir come in, and the horns come in, and then blah, 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 blah. Like everything is like at it. The stakes are so high. You're at the world is at like the brink of destruction, and then finally you enter the last phase where Ori is literally suspended in the air. There's no floor. You're gonna die if you fall. You're bashing on nothing, and the heroic music kicks in. The da 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 da. It's such a good track. For this last part where you're almost beating Shriek, Shriek is almost dead. The heroic music starts kicking in the last, most desperate, most difficult part of the fight. As you're flying over nothing. It's a perfect sequence. It's a perfect sequence. This is why I'm not getting emotional now describing it, but I was getting emotional thinking about the sequence for this review. It gets me so emotional, even though it's like, it's not necessarily about the characters or the story or any of the complexity there. It's just the cinematic perfection of it. The cinematic perfection of what's being presented alone makes you feel emotional and makes me care for the world and the events and the outcome, even though the world on an intellectual level is primitive. Yeah, that's what it is. That's cinematic perfection. It's the music which makes you feel, combined with visual intensity, which of course is in the artwork, and the desperate gameplay where you're having a hard time just trying to survive, trying to move fast, trying to avoid certain death. And on top of that, it's also what's happening on screen. If you pay attention in all of these escape sequences, there's usually insane things happening in the background that you don't even notice initially. It's the world effect that's taking place. Think about it. In the Ginso tree in Ori 1, the dried up Ginso tree is turning back on. The water's beginning to flow and fill up this tree, returning waters to the forest of Nibel. In the element of wind in the Forlorn Ruins, the wind is turning back on and starting to flow and starting to gush, and the forest is beginning to breathe again. And in Fleeing Kuro, the whole forest is burning. The volcano's erupting. There's fire everywhere. The whole forest will burn down if you don't win. The whole forest is at stake right now. The actions of the characters, that's the important thing. The world itself is changing as you're jumping, climbing, running, fighting, everything that you're doing. That's what important of cinematic perfection in action sequences. The actions of the character, your actions in the gameplay, are all combined with the world-altering events taking place in the background, in the foreground, and just everywhere around you if possible. These events elevate the things that you're doing because it means things are happening to the world, not just to you and not just to the characters. In Ori 2, there's more escape sequences. Not all of them have a world-altering thing happening. Like the avalanche doesn't and the sandworm doesn't, but then the wellspring turning back on does. The watermill becoming dislodged, starting to churn the water again as, the wellspring is going to turn back on and clean up the waters of the forest. And then, of course, Shriek, and in the Shriek and Ori fight, and I didn't even notice this at first, but the spirit Willow actually collapses in the background as platforms start to fall, signaling that this is it. This is the end. The Willow is dead. The world is collapsing. The decay is going to destroy everything. It's all at its brink. Everything matters now. You have to win or else it's all over. And that combination of visual intensity, gameplay difficulty, music, and world-changing stuff happening behind you is what creates the cinematic perfection. That's why it feels so hard, even when the overall story on a logical level is pretty simplistic. My analysis is that these ingredients put together, the ingredients of music, desperate action, and world-changing effects behind you, those three ingredients together are what creates cinematic perfection in an action sequence. In an action sequence, you need the world-changing stuff to be happening behind the character. And that's what always gets the biggest emotional reaction out of me. Even if I don't care that much about the story, even if the story doesn't make a whole lot of sense or isn't very deep or intellectual, but the sequence of cinematic perfection always gets me going. Certain genres are also just better for that in general, like in sci-fi. You have the sequence in just a few examples. You have the sequence in Interstellar where they have to dock the ship. No time for caution, and the soundtrack for that is amazing too. Or the opening sequence in the movie Gravity where the whole spaceship is spinning out of control as it's being hit by debris. And Ori does this marvelously in video game form. In this particular area of cinematic power, Ori is the best Metroidvania hands down. Ori 2, because Ori 2 surpasses Ori 1. Ori 1's escape sequences are good, but they don't have the power of Shriek and Ori, the last fight. That fight, in terms of gameplay, in terms of sound, in terms of look and feel, in terms of everything, is unmatched. Except for the phases where you just have to hit the bird in the head. But other than that, the presentation quality of it has the characteristic of, has that cinematic power. Yeah, in other areas, Ori 2 falls behind. But if we judge it as a game overall, including all the different gameplay elements, all other criteria, the value of the experience in totality is easily outpaced by like a Super Metroid or a Hollow Knight. But in this area of cinematic power, in this area, it's easily the best Metroidvania game. Like the closest sequence in Hollow Knight that even gets close to the cinematic power of Ori 2 is where you fight the Radiants, but even that doesn't come close to this. The Radiants fight is impressive to a degree as well in this regard, because you load up into the Radiants fight and then the whole screen shines bright and you have the name of the boss read out on the whole screen rather than just at the bottom. That alone tells you what you're in store for, and then immediately the music kicks in like, ha, ha. But it doesn't have the power of this. It can't. Here you have a whole orchestra, you have an elaborate music sequence matching the phases of the fight. It's way more powerful than that. The cinematic power of Ori Will of the Wisps probably rivals most games that are out there, not let alone most Metroidvanias. But in the Metroidvania category, it's easily the best in terms of cinematic power. And I hope people use this game as a learning for how to do cinematic power in further games to come. With that we're at the end of my review. That's pretty much it. Yeah, that's all I have to say. That's all my points covered. I hope you enjoyed listening, and I hope you took learnings from this analysis, and I hope to see you all next time. Cheers.